So for today's topic, which is going to be about the multi-site deployment with multiple UCMs, the points that we're going to cover is create the SIP peer trunk and enable the Ldap Sync, and also configure the eventless BLF on the IP phones. And I'm going to explain that in more details when we go through the web interface and the presentation as well. Then we're going to finish with call routing, so that you can allow users to call from one UCM to another UCM. And then we'll wrap up this webinar with Q&A. All right, so this is basically what we're trying to do in Boston, one in Dallas. I'm using private IP addresses for today's demonstration. Most likely you're going to be dealing with either VPN tunnel, or you're going to be dealing with public IP addresses, the same thing. So everything that I'm going to show you applies to either one VPN, public IP, or local IP addresses. So we have two UCMs. We're going to try to peer them together. We're going to enable the Ldap Sync. The Ldap Sync essentially allows the UCMs to exchange the directory information, so that if extension 1001 calls extension 2001 from the second UCM, it's going to show its contact information, like the first name and the second name. If there's an email information, it's going to show that information as well. Then, because the peer SIP trunk, you can do it with one UCM to another UCM, or you can have one UCM peered with multiple UCMs, or you can have multiple UCMs, all of them interconnected. Let me just go back here just to explain one more thing. So in our scenario that I'm going to be demonstrating shortly, we're going to use the Boston UCM as the main UCM. So users from Dallas, when they make outbound calls, all the calls, they're going to go through the SIP trunk of the Boston UCM that is registered to NITSP. All right, so I'm just going to jump to the web interface of the UCM. So I have two UCMs here. I added the name so that we don't get confused. So we have the Dallas UCM, and then we have the Boston UCM. So first of all, we're going to start with the Boston UCM, which is the main UCM in our implementation. You log into the UCM, and the first thing you need to do is create SIP trunk. So basically, you're going to go to VoIP trunks. And as you can see right here, I already have a register SIP trunk. So this is the SIP trunk that users from both UCMs, they're going to use to make outbound calls to external numbers. So I'm going to create a peer trunk. So make sure you select the peer SIP trunk. And this is Boston UCM, so I'm going to call it Dallas trunk. And the IP address, or the host name of the Dallas trunk, I need to go back here so I can get the IP address of the Dallas UCM, then paste the trunk. One thing that you want to check is, if you check the keep trunk caller ID, that means when users that are registered to the Boston UCM, when they call the extensions on the Dallas UCM, it's always going to show the caller ID that you configure right here. Okay, so in our case, we don't want to use the trunk caller ID. We want to keep the extensions. So if extension 2002 calls extension 2001 on the Dallas UCM, we want to show that extension to 1001 that it is actually 2002 with the name of the name that is using that extension, so they can see it on the IP phone. We're not going to use net, because in our case, we are using all private IP addresses. So if you want to record calls going through that SIP trunk, make sure you check that one. Otherwise, you can leave it unchecked, save, and apply. So now we have the Dallas trunk created, but there are some other settings that we also need to configure. And one of these options is this option right here, which is really important. It's the enable heartbeat detection. That's the mechanism that the UCMs they will use to keep track of each other. So by default, it's configured to monitor the status of the SIP trunk every 60 minutes. In other words, if this UCM tries to reach the other UCM using the SIP options message, and it's going to try, I believe, up to 5 times. If there's no response from the remote UCM, the status of the trunk will change from reachable to unmonitored or unavailable. This way you would know that there is a problem with the trunk. So this is very important to check this option and have it enabled when you have a peer SIP trunk. So I'm going to save this configuration here. Then I'm going to go back to the Dallas UCM, and I'm basically going to do the same thing. Go to VoIP trunks. Make sure you select the peer SIP trunk. And this one, I'm going to call it Boston trunk. And the IP address, I'm going to put the IP address of the Boston UCM, which is the 159. Paste, we're going to keep the same configuration. We're not going to configure the caller ID because we would like to show the internal extension number together with the first name and the last name or the display name associated with that extension. And enable the heartbeat detection, save, and apply the changes. And we can go back to the Boston UCM and go to the dashboard so we can monitor. And you can see that the status changed from unmonitored to reachable. So the SIP peer trunk between the UCMs is now established, the connection is there, and the status also confirms that. Another thing that you might want to add when you do the peer SIP trunk between two UCMs is enable the Ldap Sync. The Ldap Sync is something that you enable under the peer SIP trunk, then you go to advanced settings, and there's this option right here. So when you enable Sync Ldap, it's going to ask you for the password. One thing to keep in mind is that the password of the Ldap Sync in both UCMs need to be identical. So if I put this password right here, I should put the same password on the other UCM. And also make sure you add the same port number. This is a good practice. I usually put the same port number on both UCMs for Ldap Sync. So this way I would know which one is which, especially when I have multiple SIP trunks. So I'm going to click Save and apply the changes. Then I go back to the Boston UCM and I do the same thing. Ldap Sync, make sure you put the same password. If you put two different passwords, in other words, if you put a password on the Boston UCM that is different than the one on the Dallas airport, Ldap Sync will not work. Save and apply the changes. So now that the peer SIP trunk is established, Ldap Sync is enabled, the next step you need to do on either UCM is click on this icon right here that says Sync Ldap. You can do it from one UCM, and you can see that it's downloading remote Ldap data, and I can do the same thing from the other UCM. So now that the Ldap is synced between the two UCMs, the extension information of each UCM is exchanged, and you will have access to the remote extensions on the local UCM. And let's go back to the extensions right here so I can show you the difference. And one thing that you should always do, it's a good practice to do that one. So when you have multiple UCMs paired together, always make sure that you use a different extension range for each UCM. In my example, I'm using extension range 2000 on the Boston UCM, and the Dallas UCM, I'm using extension range 1000. So this way, it would make my call routing way easier. I can just configure the outbound routes to go to 2000, and when there's a call coming for 1000, I can configure an inbound and outbound route for 1000. So that's something also to take note of. Always use different extension range on both UCMs. So now that the Ldap Sync is completed and successful, the remote extensions, you're going to have access to them. So when you configure, I'm going to show you this one, for example. So when you go, for example, and you want to include the ring group, and you want to include extensions from the remote UCM, as long as extensions from the local UCM, I can select here the local members, and then I can add the remote members. So this way, if someone calls the ring group, the call is actually going to ring the local extensions as well as the remote extensions. And this option, you can have it on the ring group. You can also have the remote extensions on the event list, which I'm going to use later to show you why you need to use it and what's the purpose of event list. So I just want to show you here that the contacts got synced. Both UCMs, now they share the directory between the two. The next thing, after we create the trunks and the status is reachable, the Ldap is synced, the next thing you need to do is create the call routing. So remember that the Boston UCM will become our main router, which means all calls going outside will go through the UCM in Boston. So first thing, we need to go to the Dallas UCM, and we can call it, you can create one outbound route, or you can create two outbound routes. It's up to you. So I'm going to give you an example how you can create both patterns in the same outbound route. So you can only have one outbound route for all calls going through the Boston UCM. So we can just give a name of outbound, and then here we can specify the pattern. We can add the 10 digits. We can add 11 digits. And then we can add the remote extensions. And remember, if you go back to Boston UCM, they're using extension 2000. So I'm going to configure the outbound route. I'm going to tell it if someone tries to call any extension that starts with 2000, make sure you send it over this outbound route. My extensions are configured with national privilege, so I can just choose national. And then I'm going to select the Boston trunk so that all the calls can go through the Boston trunk. Save and apply. The next thing, we need to configure inbound for the Boston trunk. So the pattern that we're going to use here is going to be 1000. So I'm going to put 1. Why we're putting 1000? Because the Dallas UCM, let me go back here quickly. Because the Dallas UCM is using extension range 1000 in the extension range. That's why we need to specify the pattern for 1000. So here you can specify the destination. So in our example, let's say extension 2000 want to call extension 1000. If you configure, for example, extension 1, you choose the extension mode, and you put 1000, regardless of which extension you're trying to call, on the Dallas UCM, the call is always going to go to 1002. And this is not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is, if someone calls extension 1000, we want this UCM to call extension 1000. If someone is trying to call extension 1003, we want this UCM to send the call to 1003. So that's why you need to choose and set that one to the mode by DID. And here, the DID destinations, By default, it's only the extensions. If users, let's say you create conference rooms on the Dallas UCM, and you want users from the Boston UCM to be able to call conference rooms, call queues, ring groups, or also do paging to the extensions on the Dallas UCM. Just make sure you select the ones that you're interested in. Excuse me. Sorry, if you want them to make calls to call queue, ring group, extensions, just make sure you select the ones that are going to be reachable from the Boston UCM. So save and apply the changes. Then here we're going to have to do the same thing, create inbound, except that here we're going to do something different. Here in the pattern, we're going to put extension 2000. In other words, anyone or any call going through to any extension that starts with 2000, we want to use this outbound route. And another thing is we want the UCM as well of the Boston to receive calls of 10 digits. And I'm going to explain to you why you need that. Sorry. Try again. The reason why we need 10 digits and 11 digits, because as I mentioned earlier, the Dallas users, every time they make a call outside, it's going to go through the SIP trunk that is registered to the UCM in Boston. So that's why we're telling the Boston UCM, if someone from Dallas UCM tries to call at 10 digits or 11 digits, we want to use the by the ID. In other words, the UCM of Boston is going to receive the call, is going to check the two header to see what is the destination caller ID. And then based on the number in the caller ID, it's going to forward it. If it's an external number, it's going to send it through the registered SIP trunk that we have already created for the ITSP. And the same thing, I mean, if you have users from Dallas trying to call ring groups, call queues, conference on the Boston UCM, just make sure you check these. In other words, if you have a Boston conference room with extension 6300 and someone from Dallas tries to join the conference, it's not going to work if you don't have it added right here. So make sure you add them if you have that kind of implementation. So save and apply the changes. And then we need to add another outbound route so that users in Dallas can call users in Boston, I'm sorry, can call extensions in Dallas, which is all the extensions that start with 1000. The privilege level should be national because that's how I created my extensions. And then I'm going to choose the Dallas trunk, save, and apply. So now I have my trunk reachable. I have the directory shared between the two UCMs, and I have call routing added to both UCM. Just one thing to keep in mind is when you have multiple UCMs, so let's say you have more than two UCMs, you have Boston, Dallas, and another UCM in Chicago, you're basically going to repeat the same stuff. Just make sure you create inbound and outbound based on the extension range and caller ID. And one more thing that might give you problems if you don't configure it as I'm going to show you is the Ldap Sync is not going to work if you have two SIP trunks using the same Ldap port. In other words, so this one for Dallas UCM, we're going to use Ldap port 6080. If you want to add Chicago UCM, make sure you use a different port. Because if you try to use the same port on all the Ldap ports, on all the VoIP trunks, the Ldap Sync will not work. So that's something to keep in mind when configuring the Ldap Sync on multiple UCMs. So the next thing I'm going to show you now is let me go back to the slides so we can talk about that. Uh, the UCM supports the event list BLF, and the event list BLF, basically what it does, it allows extensions on UCMA to monitor extensions on UCMB. In our example, I can configure extension 1000 to monitor extension 2000, 2001, 2002 on the remote UCM. Even if they don't belong to the same UCM, you can still monitor them. So that's one of the benefits of using event list BLF. Another benefit of using event list BLF, even if you don't have a peer-to-peer connection, is that event list BLF reduces the amount of traffic generated in the network uh, that is caused by so much or so many subscription messages and so many notify messages. Because a lot of people, they go to the phone, if they have 24 MPKs, they just configure 24 BLFs. And when you configure 24 BLFs, you basically add a lot of traffic to your network because the phone has to subscribe for each BLF and has to receive and notify for each BLF. And when you do the event list, it condenses the amount of SIP subscriptions and notifiers. So instead of, for example, sending 9 subscription messages for 9 BLFs, the phone and the UCM can only send 1 subscription messages that includes all the 9 BLFs. So that's going to reduce the amount of traffic generated in the network and also reduces a lot of traffic. So these are two of the benefits of using eventless BLF. And the first one that I mentioned, which allows you to monitor extensions on different UCM. Without eventless BLF, you will never be able to monitor other extensions. So in our case, you must use eventless BLF. So let's go back to the UCM so we can see how we can configure that. So I'm gonna first go to the Boston UCM. And by the way, if you want to add a name to the UCM, you just go to PBX, General Settings, and then you can assign it a name right here, the device name. So in case you're managing multiple UCMs, you would know which UCM you're in. So I'm going to go back to Call Features and look for Event List right there. So I'm going to create one event list. And the URI basically is just the name of the event list. So I'm going to call this one, for example, sales. Assuming that I have 2 sales member in Dallas and 2 sales member in Boston. So I'm going to choose 2 members from Boston. Then I'm going to select the sales extension in Dallas. Then what's going to happen, these 4 extensions will become members of the same event list BLF group. Then save and apply the changes. So it's a very easy process. So now I have the URI or the event list created on the UCM. Now I need to add it on the phone. So I'm going to go and log into one of the phones. So I have GRP 2614. So this is what you need to do. So I have this extension registered to Boston UCM. I'm going to go to account 2, SIP settings. Then I go to advanced features. And this is where you add the event list to your phone. It's going to ask you to enter the event list URI. So we call it sales. So make sure you enter the exact name. If you have sales all lowercase in the UCM and then you come to the phone and you make sales with uppercase S, it's not going to work. So make sure it is exactly the same. So you do sales, and that's all you need to do on the phone, then save and apply. The GXP and the GRP phones, they give you another option that we call auto provision event list. You can add those event lists manually, and I'm going to show you how you can do that. Or I'm sorry, probably I'm not in the right, yes, right there. So if you want to push them automatically so that the UCM can provision the phones when they reboot, choose BLF event list. You don't have to go to the phone and configure it manually with the event list. The UCM is going to push all these changes to the phone. If you would like to do it manually, which means you want to go to the phone and you want to add those event lists so you can choose which button is assigned to who, then in this case, just make sure you save and apply those changes. And then you go to Programmable Keys. And I'm going to go here. And then I need to look for event list BLF. I'm using account 2 with the Boston UCM. And then the description, description doesn't matter. If it's for example, you want to call it Dallas sales, then you can enter the remote extension, which is 1001, and you can add another one. So remember, we're using account 2. Then you can call this one Dallas sales number 2 and 1002. Remember, the extensions that you add right here, they must be included in the event list BLF. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And then you can add the local BLF. So earlier we did 2000, and then you can call it, for example, sales Boston sales manager. Then save and apply the changes. One thing about the event list BLF is that it requires rebooting the phone. So once you make all these changes, you must reboot the phone for the BLF to work properly on your phone. If you don't reboot the phone, what's going to happen? The LEDs might not work properly. So make sure you save and apply and then reboot the phone. And you can do the same thing on the Dallas UCM, pretty much the same steps that I showed you on the Boston UCM. You just go ahead and create the same thing on the Dallas UCM. So that, I believe, concludes the 4 points for today's webinar. If you guys have any questions, we still have some time. Please go ahead and ask them, and Angela will help me with the questions.
Yes, thank you. There are a few questions. So here they are. Here's the first one. What IP address should be used for the SIP trunk when using VPN, local or public IP address?
So let me go back here. Let's talk about the VPN. So when you have a VPN tunnel established, for example, between these two routers, the local IP address of the UCM, which is 192.168.100.114, for example, that's the one that you're going to need to use as the SIP trunk for the peer SIP trunk. If you have the two UCMs connected over the public network, what you need to configure is the public IP address of the router, which is, in our example, this is not a public, but let's assume it's a public IP. This is the public IP that you need to include in the SIP trunk. And then you have to go to the router and make sure you configure port forwarding for SIP and Ldap. By default, the SIP will use port 5060. If that's the case, just make sure and you go to the router and you configure port forwarding for 5060. So all the traffic coming on that port goes to the UCM. And I'm talking about UDP ports, not TCP ports, which is the default one.
Okay, thank you. So here's about maybe a two-part question. So I'll read it. How do you exclude an extension for being synced through LDAP? And then how do you sync the LDAP when two UCMs use the same extension range?
Okay. So in case you have an extension, let's say, for example, this is an extension that is assigned to something that you don't want it to be included in the Ldap Sync. You just go to the extension, and I believe you go under features, and you make sure you disable this option. So once you choose the extension and you disable the Ldap, this extension will not become a member or will not be part of the Ldap directory. And then you can save and apply the changes. And when you make the Ldap sync, that extension will not be synced with the other UCMs. And the second question, sometimes you have two UCMs, they're using the same configuration, the same extension range, except for different names and stuff. But one day you decided to pair them together and you find out that both of them are actually using identical extension range. If that's the case, then you can go to the peer trunk under advanced setting so that you can differentiate between them. You need to use an option that we call Ldap Outbound rule. So when you set that one to self-defined and you added a prefix, let's say I added 5, or you can add 9, or it's up to you which prefix you want to add. When the two UCMs sync the Ldap, the remote extensions, all of them will be prefixed or prepended by 9. And users on the other UCM, if they want to call the extensions on the remote UCMs, they always need to prepend with 9. And then when you go to the, let me go back here quickly. And then when you go back to, let's say I prepended all the extensions in the Dallas UCM with 9. So this UCM is going to receive calls prepended with 9. Then I'm going to tell it to strip the leading digits. So it's going to receive 9 1002. It's going to strip 9 and then send the call to extension 1002. So that's one way of managing UCMs that are using the same extension range.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't see any more questions coming by, so that will conclude our presentation for today. As always, if there are any other questions that do arise, please don't hesitate to contact Grandstream or Streetwave, and we'll be gladly helping to answer those questions. Again, this webinar was recorded, so we'll be sending it out to everybody within the next few days. Abdel, thank you for the presentation. If there's anything else that you wanted to just add before we conclude, please go ahead and do so right now.
Well, I don't have anything to add, Angela. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone, and happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays. Thanks, everybody. Bye. All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you all for the questions. And again, thank you, Barden and Mimosa team, for helping out and doing the presentation. As always, if there's any questions, please reach out to Streakwave and Mimosa, and we'll be glad to help answer anything. Any last-minute things that you wanted to add, Barden?
No, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their busy schedule to join and learn more about Mimosa Bayer span point to multi-point solutions.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
All right.